feeling better. At the end of the talk, we'll have a little bit of time for question and answers. So if you have some questions, please use the chat box to the right of your screen. And I'm going to get to as many questions as I can at the end. If I don't get to your question, or you want to schedule a little bit of time after the talk to speak with me, there are some spots available in the hour after our talk. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my PowerPoint and we'll get started. Okay, so I am certified in functional medicine and functional neurology, and I discovered my own Hashimoto's disease about 15 years ago and have been on my own personal journey since then to figure out different ways to help heal myself, especially when I run into roadblocks where I feel like I've done everything I can and I'm still not feeling 100% better. And I've used a lot of those techniques to help my patients and clients. And this is a chart that I use when people typically come in. I like people to get a sense of where they feel like they are on the illness and wellness scale. Most of us feel like, oh, we're pretty healthy, we're pretty well. But when you look at this chart, it helps to see that maintaining good health and optimal health is actually a little bit challenging. And we're actually moving very actively in one direction or another, even if we don't realize we're doing it. So I use this to help people get a sense of where they are and really where they want to go and how much work they're willing to do to get there. So every time you eat or drink, you're either feeding disease or fighting it. This is one slide that I typically use in an in-person presentation. We have a banana and a slice of wheat bread and a Snickers bar and a teaspoon of sugar. And I like people to start to think about what is the glycemic load of each of those foods compared to the other, and which one has the highest glycemic load. And it turns out that the bread actually has the highest glycemic load of all of those. When we look at those, it's easy to think, well, the Snickers bar or the teaspoon of sugar, but it turns out of all of those, the bread has the highest glycemic load. Here we go. Okay. Hopefully you'll be able to see that now. Okay. Able to see it? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Okay, so some technical Zoom difficulties here. So functional medicine is what I do and what I love to do all day. And this is one of my favorite little cartoons where when you look at, go to a typical Western medical model-based practice, typically what happens is we have this really wide range of labs that we're looking at. And CLIA, the board that accredits all labs in the United States, determines what those ranges are. So for blood sugar, for example, those ranges are determined based on each lab individually. So you're basing your own health essentially on the population you live around. So if you are higher or lower than the population in general that you live around, it will trigger as an abnormal result. But if you are still within that range, but toward the low end, like this poor woman in the cartoon, you may not register as being abnormal, but according to the functional medicine model, you're definitely not optimally healthy. And that's really what functional medicine aims to do, is to find the root of the problem and to help you optimize your health in general. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so these are a couple of pie charts that show rough recommendations of the USDA, where we have a food guide pyramid that has the bottom of mostly carbohydrates and very little fat and essentially very little protein compared to what our ancestors ate. And there's a whole lot of research now on primal diets and paleo eating, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we individualize those things based on each person. But we can see there's a clear difference between what our ancestors ate and what we are actually eating today as a society as a whole. Most of you here have already started exploring eating gluten-free, potentially lower carb, maybe autoimmune paleo. And we'll talk through a little bit of those things as we move along. So gluten-free, it's important if you're going to use gluten-free products, that they're certified gluten-free. And as of 2018, gluten-free was a $4 billion industry. It's going to be roughly an $8 billion industry by 2026. And it's estimated that 40% of the population of the United States can't properly process gluten. I would think it's probably a little bit higher than that, but that is the current statistic. And we're going to talk a little bit about gluten and brain health as we move through as well. It used to be when people were diagnosed with celiac disease, they had frank GI problems, lots of diarrhea, malnutrition, weight loss, and now we realize the last statistic that I heard was that 66% of people who are diagnosed with celiac disease actually have no gut symptoms. So this has turned into more a subclinical, almost unknown sensitivity for some people, and usually people end up presenting by saying, we just don't feel well, we're not sure what's wrong, we can't figure out why we don't feel well or why we're so tired, or why we can't lose weight in more cases than not. And a lot of that is based on your genetics, and we'll talk through that as well as we go through here. So these are some of the conditions associated with gluten sensitivity. This is actually a small list of some conditions that are associated with a gluten sensitivity. Autoimmunity is the primary population that I work with. And we're starting to see more and more things, especially with osteoporosis, malabsorption, and neurological disorders in particular. This is a picture there are 3 different examples here of what a gluten sensitivity can look like when it presents in the body. And we're seeing more and more different variations of this. We have hand rashes, sometimes bumps, the small intestine, villus atrophy, on a colonoscopy in the middle, and then toward the right is some skin or a skin alteration or abnormality because of a gluten sensitivity. And autoimmunity is, we were talking about autoimmunity a little bit before. Autoimmunity is a genetic predisposition. You're born with a genetic predisposition to develop an autoimmune process. And what happens in autoimmunity is the body gets confused and starts attacking itself. This is a very short list of many different types of autoimmunity. Cyrex is a lab that can actually check for antibodies of most of these different autoimmune processes, as well as Vibrant America looks at those. Excuse me. So when it comes to autoimmunity, this is a chart that I use every day in my practice, more often than not multiple times in the day. And I feel like this is a really nice pictorial representation of what happens when you have an autoimmune process and you eat gluten or dairy or one of those cross-reactors. This was created by Datis Karazian and the Apex Energetics and also Cyrex Labs. They came up with this pictorial, and I feel like it's a really great representation. So the first on the left is the gliadin antibody. So basically what happens when you have an autoimmune process is the gluten molecule, you have a receptor site on all of the cells in your body that the gluten molecule fits right into and causes an IgG, A, E, or M inflammatory response that lasts 6 to 8 months in the body. And this is how I really help people to understand, even if they don't have a positive IgE showing up or IgG sensitivity. Let me get out of here for 1 second. It looks like we're having another little issue here. Hold on 1 second. Okay, hopefully we're all caught up. This is the chart that I was starting to show you. I apologize. So this is the chart that Datis Karazian created that I use several times a day in my practice. So the first drawing is a gluten sensitivity reaction. So if you have an autoimmune process, you have a receptor site on your cell that the gluten molecule fits right into it and causes an IgG, A, E, or M inflammatory response that lasts 6 to 8 months in the body. The trickiest part about gluten sensitivity and our response to gluten or reaction to gluten exposure is that peak symptoms from gluten exposure generally don't happen until day 16 to 18 after you eat it. So I love to use this when we're talking about, even if you don't have a positive gluten sensitivity on a food sensitivity test or even a food allergy test, why with an autoimmune process or even a genetic predisposition for autoimmunity, gluten is definitely something you need to avoid in your diet. The middle one is dairy. And that's so closely related in structure to gluten that we say clinically 100% of the time, if you can't have gluten, probably you shouldn't have dairy either. Now, there are some exceptions to those, and we'll talk about that as we move through here. The third section are the gluten cross-reactors. And those are things like buckwheat, amaranth, teff, quinoa, all the grains we think of as gluten-free. It's chocolate, it's coffee, it's soy, it's corn, it's rice, it's eggs, it's tapioca, yeast, oats, nuts, seeds. For some people, all of those cause a problem. For some people, none of them do. For some people, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 of them do, because that circle with the triangles on the side doesn't look enough like gluten for most people to have the same kind of inflammatory response. And this is where working with your individual practitioner, you'll be able to figure out exactly what you're sensitive to. And this is where you can have symptoms of gluten sensitivity even if you've given up gluten for years and years. So this next chart has a list of what I just talked about. These are some known gluten cross-reactors that can cause a sensitivity reaction. And this is partly why people have a hard time giving up gluten and dairy because gluten and dairy create gluteomorphins, truly, and casomorphins. And those act like morphine in your brain, which make it really hard to give up. Not everybody makes them, but most people do. So this is what makes it a challenge to give up gluten and dairy. And these are some allergy cross-reactors, and we use this when we're really trying to find, okay, we've got some food sensitivities, and we have some other underlying things, and we're not sure what they are. Often when ragweed is really prevalent in the air, will have people more sensitive to things like bananas and cantaloupes and honeydews. So I like to use this chart to help us understand, why are you still having symptoms when you've given up gluten and all those other things that you tested positive for? It could be because there's also an environmental component. And the bottom line when we look at all of this is that inflammation and things that cause inflammation in the body are the biggest culprit when it comes to diseases and disease states. So inflammation is a short-term protection in the body. When you sprain your ankle, you have inflammation in your body, which is by design, so you don't overuse the ankle. But when we have inflammation in the gut, what happens is it makes it much harder for our bodies to absorb the nutrition that we take in. And if we're talking about gluten and at least 40% of people having an inability to process gluten in general, it's the equivalent of stirring up water and flour and spreading that on the inside of your small intestine, kind of like wallpaper paste. It makes it harder for the villi in your small intestine to absorb your nutrition from your diet. Inflammation is truly the leading cause of morbidity and mortality in the United States. Coronary artery disease and cancer, diabetes, and Alzheimer's, et cetera, are all clearly linked to an inflammatory process. There was a study about 6 years ago that showed that elderly people who regularly use NSAIDs, not that I'm advocating use of that, but the study showed that people who regularly used NSAIDs like Advil, et cetera, had a 40% reduced risk of Alzheimer's, because we're clearly linking that now to an inflammatory process. And we'll talk a little bit about Alzheimer's disease. it's expected that 100 million people will have Alzheimer's disease by 2050. It's now being called type 3 diabetes. There's almost always a component of insulin resistance that goes with Alzheimer's disease. And the rates of obesity, diabetes, and Alzheimer's rates are on the rise in the United States. And we now know that there's an awful lot we can do about it. David Perlmutter's book, Brain that came out years ago, really started talking about how much power we have in regards to diet and even supplements if diet doesn't do everything it needs to do to help with brain inflammation, dementia, and Alzheimer's. We're expecting the rate of diabetes, if we don't really make some big changes, to triple in the next 40 years. So a little bit more about Alzheimer's and brain shrinkage. We almost always see blood sugar in the high normal range. Diabetes is another term for what's happening, where we have a blood sugar dysregulation and obesity, which is expected to show up in roughly half of the people in the United States in the next 10 years. So from a brain health perspective, we know that we can look at some genes now, and more genes are being linked to brain health. We know that ApoE is a really big one. That is, if there's a heterozygous or a homozygous mutation on the ApoE, we know that you're more likely to have things like mild cognitive impairment or foggy brain, all the way up to dementia in some cases. And that's just a genetic marker that we know of that we can use. And ApoE makes it in general more of a challenge for your body to absorb fats and also grains. So we know if we can facilitate those two processes by looking at that gene and then using epigenetics to look at multiple other genes in those pathways, that we can really improve your health overall. So we have a bit of an out of control process happening in this country. So we're essentially living with chronically high blood sugar. We're in general eating way too many carbs. We were taught, in the 80s and 90s that low-fat diet was the way to go, and there's still a sense of fat phobia, I think, in the United States. There's a clear connection now between high-fat diet and positive brain health, good brain health, and I think we're still slowly making that shift. There are a lot of people who have an undiagnosed sensitivity to gluten. We are essentially genetically modifying most of our food and have been for a long time, both genetically modifying it and hybridizing our food. And the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease in 2012 had an article that said that older individuals who eat lots of carbs are 4 times as likely to develop mild cognitive impairment, which is the beginning stage of dementia. This is a little picture of what happens with leaky gut and how gluten can impact your ability to digest and absorb nutrition. At the top, you have the little villi or cilia, and that's how nutrition is absorbed into your bloodstream, which is where those tiny pieces at the bottom of the drawing are going. But what happens when you spread that wallpaper paste on the inside of your small intestine for a long time is you end up with a breakage of those protein-linked cross bridges that connect cilia to cilia. And what happens when those things get broken is that food that's actually too large to pass through the villi or the cilia actually end up getting absorbed into the bloodstream. And when those foods get absorbed into the bloodstream is when you start to develop food sensitivities, especially to things that you eat frequently. This is a copy or a little summary of what Cyrex Labs does in order to look for leaky gut and intestinal permeability of gluten and zonulin are things that should stay in your small intestine. If they show up in your bloodstream, we know that you more than likely have leaky gut. And that's how those, if you remember the chart that had those 3 circles on it with the triangles, that third category, those gluten cross-reactors, that's how we tend to sensitize to those more if we do have leaky gut. So the bottom line is we have inflammatory foods, whether we're sensitive to it or genetically predisposed to not be able to tolerate it well, which leads to chronic inflammation, which decreases our body's intestinal filtration ability, which increases intestinal permeability. We then have foreign substances entering the bloodstream, which causes an immune response, an IgG or M, inflammatory response, that we can actually measure in the blood for 6 to 8 months, which can either cause autoimmunity, chronic diseases, fatigue, or allergies, or exacerbate those symptoms if we already have them. So we're going to talk a little bit about diet and cholesterol and fat and just how beneficial fat is for us. Part of this is from David Perlmutter's book, Grain Brain, and he's written a more advanced version of that since the original came out. One of the studies he cited in his book showed that high cholesterol reduces the risk for brain disease. When your cholesterol is higher than 240, you're actually at lower risk of developing some type of brain disease. A 39% increase in cholesterol equals a 15% decrease in mortality, according to the Lancet in 2013. And fat is a key to health and brain function. It also makes your cells more bulletproof. So the fact that fat and elevated cholesterol have been linked together for so many years, I think perpetuates the fat phobia in the United States. But there are more and more books and articles now showing that there's really very little association, if any at all, between high cholesterol and heart disease, or even high fat consumption and heart disease. So the Framingham study on brain health showed that diets highest in healthy fats, those omega-3s, those individuals had a 42%, they were 42% less likely to experience mild cognitive impairment. The diets that were highest in meat, those individuals were 21% less likely to experience mild cognitive impairment. And regular consumption of omega-3s decreased the risk of Alzheimer's by 60%. And when we talk about diets highest in meat, there's a really big trend in the literature lately, and in podcasts also, blog posts of being vegetarian and not eating meat. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through. Diets highest in meat are definitely not the best diet for everybody. And that's where your individual practitioner can really help you figure out, am I one of those people that would really thrive as a vegetarian, or do I really need to have meat in my diet, or some sort of combination of those things? So this is a fun little cartoon. The high carb diet I put you on 20 years ago gave you diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Oops. So we're trying to figure out what to feed people. And we now know, fortunately, that there are many, many ways that we can individualize things for you. It seems a little scary, like we don't know what to eat, but there's actually a whole lot you can do, especially with you're working with a functional medicine practitioner who can help you. So we're looking at what's left to eat. We're looking at meat for some people, most organic vegetables, some fermented foods maybe to your gut tolerance and even your blood type tolerance, low glycemic organic fruits. Usually we limit those, especially at first, because most people end up presenting to the office with some type of blood sugar dysregulation. Olives and olive oil, coconut oil for some people, apple cider vinegar for some people, but this has all got to be individualized truly for you and what your body can tolerate. So there's some of the different diet types out there, and there are so many. I didn't list all of them, but we have gluten-free, low carbohydrate, etc. Whole30 has been around for a long time now, probably 12 or 15 years, which is a really nice way to start if you have a new autoimmune process and you're trying to eliminate some of those, the gluten, the dairy, and the gluten cross-reactors from your diet. FODMAPs. FODMAPs are fermentable oligo and monosaccharides, and those are harmful or irritants to some people's guts. AIP is autoimmune paleo. There's a Mediterranean diet, the low-fat diet. The last two things I have a number of slides on as we move through. I've been doing a lot of clinical research myself on both intermittent fasting, prolonged fasting, and fasting mimicking diet. So there is a whole lot of new research around these topics that I really want to share with you. It's pretty exciting information. So when you're talking to your practitioner about, well, how do we really know what we should eat, you want to make sure that you're looking at your genetic profile. You're looking at Nutrigenomics. Based on your genetics, how easy is it for your body to absorb nutrition in many different ways? What type of diet is right for you? What type of exercise is right for you? What type of supplementation is right for you? Based on genetics, you can look at your caffeine tolerance, your lactose intolerance or not, your metabolic tendencies, and even your disease risk. So we can individualize your nutrition. There we go. Let me get that out here. By combining your nutrition history, your hormone profile, your current hormone profile, your current metabolic profile, looking at your microbiome, so quantifying your microbiota, which is your good and bad bacteria in your intestines, and what types of foods will feed those in both a good way and a not such a good way. Looking at your environmental toxin exposure and looking at your genetics. And all of these things together interact with your lifestyle factors. So your diet, your exercise that you're doing, how well you handle stress or not, how much sleep you're getting, and then your self-care in general. So we'll talk a little bit about hormones, because we're going to talk about that when it comes to fasting a little bit later on. Hormones control your not only reproduction, but also growth, sleep, hunger, your metabolism, in general, and they're very closely related to thyroid and thyroid imbalance, as well as adrenal fatigue. Adrenal stress and adrenal fatigue can also lead to things like sugar cravings, anxiety, fatigue, and thyroid dysfunction. And it's important to test your hormones and know where you stand. From a genetic perspective, the human genome was mapped in 2003, and we now know that we can look at your genetics in general and help you determine not only how well do you process things or absorb things, but how are your genes being expressed? And that's where genetic SNPs come into play. And SNPs are when cells are dividing and DNA is being copied, sometimes there's a mistake and a building block of DNA is replaced, and that's called a SNP. That's a single nucleotide polymorphism. And we now know that our children are born with our genetic mutations or our SNPs. So we're passing things along genetically. Robert Malillo, who wrote Disconnected Kids and Autism and a couple of other books, talks about how in his book, actually, how we're able to now see that the genetic mutations that we have in our bodies because of things that we did, not enough sleep, poor diet, are actually being passed down to our children. So they're being born with those genetic SNPs and genetic mutations. The good news is that you can clean those things up as long as you understand what's there and what to do about it. So SNPs, either a heterozygous or a homozygous mutation, there we go, can increase the likelihood of diseases and affect the metabolism of our nutrients. It helps us to either respond really well to things like anesthetics or not so well to those things. Same with drugs. Our body's ability to recognize the good bacteria or bad bacteria and eliminate it, recognize viruses, recognize toxins, or be able to resist toxins, specifically mycotoxins or Lyme or heavy metals being stored in our body and expressed that way, is all determined by our genetic SNPs or mutations. And genes, SNPs in general, when we're talking about diet, things like sugar, processed food, flour, alcohol, can all make our SNPs a little bit worse. So the bottom line of why we're so sick is that we have modern day stressors like food, toxins, and lifestyle. They've turned on the negative effects of the SNPs that may have been asymptomatic in the past, which now predisposes us to more diseases. So when we look at SNPs in diet, it's important that you figure out what your SNPs are so that you can individualize your nutrition and lifestyle based on those SNPs and help to, which is the whole goal of functional medicine, really ward off any type of chronic disease from setting in. And we now, thankfully, in 2020, can really look at genetics and look pretty deeply with blood work and genetic testing and nutrigenomics in particular, what is really the best thing for you. So the things that are going to impact our genes more than anything are diet, like we talked about before, carbohydrates, fat, protein, water, electrolytes, exercise, either too much or too little. We don't often talk about too much exercise, possibly as much as we should, but some of us are over-exercising just as much as some of us are under-exercising. Sleep, getting enough sleep, getting deep sleep, not having sleep interrupted, and then sleeping according to your chronobiology, which we'll talk about here in a little bit too. It's important to get good quality sleep when your body is asking for it. Toxins and stress. So some SNP action plans, we now know that we can repair or reverse the negative impact of SNPs through carefully targeted lifestyle and nutrition. And we can come up with now really detailed lists of what types of foods are best for you and what type of lifestyle changes you could potentially make based on your SNPs. And when we look at your genetics, things are always changing and we're discovering more and more. And we know that we truly have the ability to make better choices based on our genetics. We use largely 23andMe and Ancestry.com, but there are a lot that you can use in order to, if you choose to look at your genetics, you can do that through those sites. Some of the most common genes that we look at in my office are the MTHFR, which a lot of you probably have heard of. In addition to the MTR and MTRR and FUT2, we have the COMT, and all of those are really involved in the methylation pathway. It's estimated that 60% of the population has one or two mutations on MTHFR, which makes it harder to absorb B vitamins, for example. DAO and MAOA, the GST, the NOS3, and PEMT. We also look a lot at the DQ2 and DQ8, which tells us your genetic predisposition for developing celiac disease. The MTHFR is linked to multiple things. In addition to B vitamin absorption, which is primarily what we look on, there's a higher risk of different types of disease states developing that have been linked to MTHFR in the literature. But our goal from a functional medicine perspective, like I said earlier, is to really find the root of whatever the problem is, find that underlying toxin if there is one, really look closely at your genetics and figure out how do we help your body to achieve its highest sense of well-being. This is a drawing that shows the methylation pathway. We're not going to spend too much time here, but you can see in those rectangles the different genetic mutations that can control how well your body processes and ultimately absorbs vitamins. This one is also another example of that. And at the bottom of that chart, you see homocysteine, and homocysteine has been linked, elevated levels above 7 actually, have been linked to increased levels of heart disease. So not only is this related to B vitamin absorption, but also related to not only heart disease, but also gut health. And then at the very bottom, you see glutathione. That's one of your most potent antioxidants. And when we're looking at living in the era of COVID and working on trying to boost our immune systems, we want to make sure that our levels of oxidative stress are as controlled as possible. And glutathione, if it's something that your body can absorb, is a really great way to do that. So we want to always personalize your nutrition. I don't ever want to guess at anything, and I definitely don't want to band-aid any problems. So we want to try to look at where you are now, consider your individual genetic variation, and also look at blood typing and genotyping. And blood typing is something that was created, or Peter D'Adamo started researching probably about 30 years ago. And he's since moved that into genotyping, and looking at those two things is a more simple and still fairly generic, but closer than we were before. Not perfect science, obviously, but basically trying to figure out where your ancestors came from, and might you be able to tolerate those same foods. And what I love about the genotyping approach is I feel like I tell people all day long, don't eat this, don't eat that. And genotyping gives us a list of foods that are actually potentially superfoods for you. So, hey, have you tried lentils? That's something we never really talked about on an autoimmune paleo approach, where we used to tell people to not ever eat any beans or legumes or anything like that. So there are ways now that we're looking at liberalizing the diet to truly help your body thrive that we really didn't fully understand before. So this next topic I'm going to talk about is fasting. This is one of my favorite topics. I've been doing a lot of research on this, a lot of experimentation on myself with this in the last number of years. And there are several different types of fasting that you can do. There's intermittent fasting in many different ways. You can do 16 hours of fasting, 17 hours, 18 hours are probably the most common that we work with. And you can do it from a few hours up to a few days. And prolonged fasting is 24 to 48 hours in general. There's a fasting mimicking diet, which mimics fasting, but is not exactly fasting. And the fasting mimicking diet mimics a little bit ketogenic diet. And the ketogenic diet, originally used for epilepsy in general, the brain actually can get 75% of its energy from ketones, is protective for the brain, and is also used in some neuro rehab. Ketogenic diet, and we're talking about fasting versus ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is great for lowering insulin, but does not lower mTOR. And mTOR is a major regulator of growth hormone in humans. So we realize now, based on the literature, there's a growing body of evidence that shows that inhibition of the mTOR complex is shown to increase lifespan and influence aging-related processes like metabolism and stem cell function. There's a water fast, which is one you definitely want to be very careful doing, and I usually recommend with a doctor's supervision. There's juice fasting and partial fasting. There's some calorie restriction, and that's similar to what fasting mimicking diet does. And personalizing your fasting is very, very important. Working with a doctor, I think, is a great way to start fasting if it's something that's new to you. We'll talk about some people we definitely don't want to fast as we move through here. But there's also a really clear link when we're talking about fasting and fasting increasing growth hormone in general. There's a clear link between growth hormone and bone health. And we see, for example, women in Asia having very low risk of osteoporosis who move to the United States and end up developing really high rates of osteoporosis compared to when they're living in Asia. And we're now starting to wonder if that's related to growth hormone, if we can improve growth hormone. And with fasting, I think it's something to look at. So chronobiology is not only looking at fasting and giving your body a break. Thinking about chronobiology for a second, in the 60s and 70s, we would have dinner at 6 and generally not eat breakfast until 8 o'clock in the morning, which is a really easy 14-hour fast. And we have so gotten away from that in the United States. There's really no reason we shouldn't be doing that. And the levels of obesity now are much higher than they were then, and that could be one reason why. So chronobiology is about not only intermittent fasting, but actually intermittent fasting according to what your body in particular is asking for. And we're least hungry at 8 o'clock in the morning, most hungry at 8 o'clock p.m. in general. And if we're least hungry at 8 o'clock in the morning, probably following the recommendation of eating breakfast, even if you don't feel like it, might not be the wisest thing. It might be the best thing for you, but that's where working with somebody can really help you figure that out. Your insulin response is definitely higher at 8 o'clock in the morning, so you're more likely to, in the evening, so you're more likely to store fat then. Your cortisol surge in the morning is what helps keep you from being hungry at 8 o'clock in the morning. And the best meal time is midday. Europeans classically eat their largest meal in the middle of the day, which is truly best for most people's bodies. But when you're looking at fasting, it's also important to building it around your life. So if you're going to eat with your husband and your children at 6 o'clock, but you decide you're going to do your fasting schedule from 12 to 2 in the afternoon, that can be a life disruptor. So making sure you're planning it around your life is important. And there should always be a feeding and a fasting period. There's also a book called The Power of When by Dr. Michael Breus, and it's working with your body's inner clock for maximum health, happiness, and productivity is another approach to really optimizing things for your body in particular. So some benefits of fasting are blood sugar control. And this is all based on the literature. We're seeing benefits in blood sugar, insulin resistance in particular, inflammation, heart health. Fasting's been associated with a lower risk of coronary heart disease and can actually, according to literature, help lower blood pressure, triglycerides, and cholesterol. Animal studies are now showing that fasting could improve brain function, increase nerve cell synthesis, and protect against neurodegenerative conditions such as Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Fasting for sure aids weight loss. One of the biggest concerns when we started the whole trend, I guess, the most recent trend of fasting is that it will shut down your metabolism and reduce your muscle mass. And we now understand it does exactly the opposite. It helps preserve muscle tissue in order to reduce body weight and body fat in general. Growth hormone is a really important reason why we should have at least a good fast in the middle of the night, because it's really clear now in the literature that studies are showing that fasting can increase levels of human growth hormone, and that's a protein hormone that plays a really big role in growth, metabolism, weight loss, and muscle strength. Animal studies also have shown that fasting can delay aging and increase longevity. And in some animal and even test tube studies, not human, but animal and test tube studies are suggesting that fasting could potentially block tumor development and increase the effectiveness of chemotherapy. So some challenges that we were looking at initially is that a lot of people felt like, well, I'm going to be hungry if I don't eat. And what we now understand is that hunger starts to abate at between 48 and 72 hours. It does come and go during that first 24 hours as well. And ghrelin is the hormone ghrelin's actually produced in the stomach largely, and some in the small intestine and the pancreas and the brain, which stimulates appetite. It increases your food intake or your desire for food intake and promotes fat storage. So we see ghrelin start to decrease as days of fast continue. Your metabolism does not get lowered, but actually increases. And your muscle is actually preserved. So these things where we used to think these things are a problem, we're actually now realizing do exactly the opposite. So some of the things that we see when we're fasting are that there's a positive impact on your sympathetic nervous system, on your cortisol levels, and also your adrenaline. And we realize that eating 6 meals a day, like we used to teach people regularly, and actually not all that long ago, actually keeps your insulin levels high enough so that you're storing body fat rather than burning it. So when you're fasting, we want to make sure that you're staying well hydrated, that when you come off of the fast, and this is where, especially if you're new to fasting, I recommend working with a doctor, because coming off of the fast can actually be more challenging in terms of refeeding syndrome than actually the fast itself. You want to make sure that you're eating nutrient-dense foods and using those amino acids from your proteins to really continue to build muscle and get those benefits of fasting when the fast is over. We want to make sure that you're minimizing physical activity and getting plenty of rest while you're actually doing the fast. The microbiome, we'll just talk about this quickly. We talked a little bit about quantifying the microbiota earlier. We want to make sure that you're looking at your microbiome and figuring out which types of foods are best for you to eat in general. So when we talk about not feeling well after getting off of gluten, we also always want to look to these things as things that could potentially be in your diet that you may be reacting to. And things that really should be avoided indefinitely anyway: high fructose corn syrup, refined oils, modified anything, emulsifiers and thickeners. Vibrant America has a great test for that now. And the more testing we do there, the more we're realizing, especially in our kiddos, that they're sensitive to a lot of those additives that we're putting in our foods. And sometimes we don't even read that label all the way to the bottom to realize what's in there. Artificial sweeteners are something that we should never be using. Stevia has a question mark because in nature, stevia is used as birth control, so it can be a bit of a hormone disruptor, especially in some women. Soy, for most people, should be avoided, although when we look at blood type, we see that A blood types in particular can sometimes tolerate soy, but that's a very individualized thing. Carrageenan, gluten and wheat, dairy, which is also variable in some people, especially when we look at blood type and genetics. We do allow some dairy where before we didn't really think it was safe at all with gluten sensitivity. Now we know there are some people who can tolerate it. Processed food and GMOs. So we want to always look at EWG, the Environmental Working Group, is a great way to look at the products that you're using to see if there are any harmful chemicals in those in your food, your cosmetics, storage containers. Your fillings can be sources of toxins. We're seeing lots and lots lately, and I feel like more and more patients have mycotoxins in their blood or heavy metals in their blood from environmental exposure. Another environmental toxin, which we don't have too much time to get into, is 5G, where we have a lot of sort of external toxins now putting burdens on our body, which can also make you continue to feel bad even if you've given up the gluten and dairy and all those things that you're testing to. We want to make sure we're looking for the true root of your problem. So EWG is a great place to go. They have a scanner that you can take to the store and look at all of the sunscreens and figure out which one is the least toxic for you and your family. You can also find this list on Environmental Working Group. They update this regularly, and this is the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. And you want to look and see, even though organic food tends to be more expensive, if there are any that you could avoid, it's those top 12 dirty foods. And then if you have to choose between some organic and some conventional, choose those to be the organic ones that you buy. This is a way that you can read produce labels if there's no sign clearly marking it. And number 4 is conventional. Number 8 is genetically modified. And 9 is organic. That's the first number in each of those foods. So you can look and see on your produce label. So it's important to eat organic because there's a clear link between pesticides and autoimmunity. There's hormones, as most of us know now, hormones and antibiotics in non-organic meat. And I like to include this in there. This was one study, and we know that one study is not the be-all and end-all, but there was an article in the British Journal of Nutrition that showed that organic produce is actually more nutritious. Now, that's just one article, but I love that information. So is it possible to prevent, treat, and improve symptoms with food and supplements? Absolutely, yes. And now we know there are so many things that we can do. We always strive to use food and physical activity and rest and stress reduction over supplements wherever we can. We want to really try to find the root of whatever problem is happening and try to help your body to achieve a level of optimal well-being that you're willing to work toward. Some tests that your doctor can perform to help you assess your risk of disease. Vibrant America is a lab that I use a lot. They have blood work. They have a mycotoxin test that's pretty fantastic. That's a urine test. They look at heavy metals, and they also do a gut profile. I'm looking at hemoglobin A1C, which is your average blood sugar over 90 days, and fructosamine, which is your average blood sugar over the past 2 weeks. It's a little bit more sensitive and specific than the A1C, and it is a 2-week profile instead of a 90-day. Looking at your fasting insulin, your blood sugar, and your levels of insulin resistance, your homocysteine, which we talked about before, vitamin D and CRP, which is an inflammatory marker, looking at a Cyrex Array 3 for gluten sensitivity, or the wheat zoomer is the Vibrant equivalent, and looking at the gluten cross-reactors. There are now multiple companies that will do that, and potentially doing a genetic test if that's something you feel comfortable with. Make sure you're looking at rules and regulations for your area about genetic testing to make sure that that data is really well protected and kept personal. And this is a little list. I don't usually put a list like this together, but this is a little list of things that David Perlmutter has in his book, Brain That Can Possibly Reduce Inflammation, Improve Brain Health Overall. Since inflammation is the root of many, many disease states, we always want to make sure that your inflammation is as low as possible. And the good thing is a lot of these things you can find in foods. CBD, DHA, resveratrol, turmeric, probiotics, coconut oil, alpha-lipoic acid, vitamin D, glutathione, and broccoli seed extract, which is also sulforaphane. So back to the original chart where you're looking at your level of health and wellness and where you are now and where you're willing to go or how much work you're willing to do in order to achieve optimal wellness. And it does take a little bit of work to get there, but if you work with a doctor who looks at you functionally and looks at all of the aspects of everything happening with you in your past and current, there are many, many more ways to get to that green wellness zone than we originally understood there to be. So it's a pretty exciting time for me to be able to help my patients even more. So you should never eat ingredients you can't pronounce, except quinoa. You should definitely eat quinoa. So this is my practice. We're in Louisville, Texas, and I have some contact information here. I really love questions and welcome questions at any time. You're welcome to call or email, and you can look at our website. And I would be more than happy to help you with any questions that you may have. So I'm going to go ahead and go over to, let me stop sharing this, and hopefully I do not mess this up. Stop sharing here. Let me see, 1 second. I have a helper because I'm not doing very well at this. Okay, so here, okay. So if I just minimize this, okay. All right, let me go up through here. Thank you all so much for telling me that you couldn't see my slides. I unfortunately could not see your comments when that was happening. Okay, let me get to the questions here. Okay. Troy asked, is 23andMe free? 23andMe has two different versions that I currently know of. One is the Ancestry version, and one is the health version. The Ancestry version costs $99, and as far as the last time I looked, and the health version costs $199. In order to do what we need to do, you can either do the $99 version of 23andMe or the $99 version of Ancestry.com. Even though that's just an Ancestry test, in general, it captures all of your genetic raw data, which is all that we need that test for. Once we have your raw data, whether it's through the Ancestry version of 23andMe or the Ancestry.com actual test, we're able to feed that through any number of different engines. We use a lot of mthfrsupport.com in order to really understand all of your genetic mutations, or most of them, and mthfrsupport.com actually has each SNP hyperlinked, and you can click on it. It takes you to SNPpedia, which is like Wikipedia for SNPs, and allows you to look at, say, the 40 journal articles that link this genetic SNP to Parkinson's, for example. So there are lots of things you can do through that website, and there are many, many more. Joe Cohen has a great website. Seeking Health has a great tool you can use as well. So there are many different ways you can do it. Do you know how to get back through this so it's easy to see these? Or should I just scroll through here? It looks like we're right at an hour. So if I don't get to your question and you want me to answer anything for you, please go ahead and email me. The email again is info@DFW, like Dallas Fort Worth, wellnesscenter.com. Taryn just asked about the average cost of the genetic testing, and that is $99 usually for genetic testing. And then depending on what past blood work you have, will help us determine what exactly type of sort of baseline blood testing we would need to do. So it's variable. It varies per person. And Carol asked, does olive oil need to be extra virgin? And yes, that is ideal. Costco has a great one currently here in Texas anyway. Okay, so if anybody has any additional questions, please email me, info@dfwwellnesscenter.com, or you can call us 972-315-9900, and we would be more than happy to help you and answer any questions you have. Thank you so much for attending.